This session, we're going to be looking at supervision in a virtual world. So this is the second of these webinars that I've done. We did one on looking at the learning environment, where I really enjoyed working with Grace as a local team manager and practice educator. And today I am really looking forward to sharing the platform with both Louise and with Dloos. Louise is going to contribute throughout the session, and Dloos has a specific part of the session where he's going to share his perspective. But also, Dloos, feel free to chip in at any point if you want to, because having the voice, I think, of a local practice educator and a student is really important. If you weren't at the last session, what I just want to say to you is that I've been a practice educator for 25 years. I started working with students 27 years ago as a practice supervisor, and I've worked with students every year during those 27 years. And this year is no different. I worked with 5 students this year during lockdown in what was called a virtual placement. So everything that I share with you today is based on experiences of working in the new ways of working, I suppose, in terms of a virtual world. So today we're going to talk about supervision. Last time, which has been recorded, so if you've not watched it, we talked about the environment and the learning environment. And in the next session, we're going to be talking about assessment of students and newly qualified workers. But supervision is a really important topic for all of us. This isn't just for practice educators. You know, supervision is something that is a key part of our journey throughout our whole social work career. So this might be something that relates to you as a practice educator, but it might relate to you as a team manager. It relates to you as an individual, because it doesn't matter where we are on our own social work journey. We all need good quality, emotionally supportive and reflective supervision. But maybe now more than ever, with changed ways of working, we all need to have good quality supervision. The research suggests that the most significant impact on the way in which we provide supervision is the supervision that we receive. So I'm going to ask you just to take a moment or two now to think about your own experiences of receiving supervision. What's your own experience of supervision? Has your supervision experience been a good one? Or has your experience of supervision been not so good? It's what's called it's actually Toni Morrison that used this phrase, taking a supervision history. For me, one of the most important things that I do with students at the start of a placement experience is to sit with them and think about their supervision history. Because if a student has had a negative experience of supervision, that will impact on how they respond to supervision during their placement with me. So just taking a moment now for you to tune into what has been your previous experience of supervision. If someone comes to a placement with me and their only experience of supervision has been, it's very focused on case management, it's very punitive, it's a space where they're told what they're not doing and what they need to do, and how many more pieces of work they need to take on, then they're going to approach supervision by thinking that that's what supervision is, where actually I want people to recognise how supervision is a reflective environment. It should be a two-way process, all of those things. But the impact of your previous experiences of supervision matters a lot. If you're working with a student, as one of the students I worked with this summer, who had never been in social care before and was a first placement student, had never experienced supervision before, she had absolutely no idea of what supervision was. She said in her evaluation at the end of the placement that supervision had been a revelation to her. So, you know, think about, what is supervision? What's your experience of supervision been? And so I just wanted you, while I'm just chatting away now, just to get in touch with what has been your previous experience of supervision. I think one of the things that is not great about social work as a profession is that there's almost an expectation. There's very little training on how to provide supervision. It's almost expected that, well, you've had supervision, so you know how to do it. And that's basically what impacts on the way in which we deliver supervision, the supervision that we have received. So it's important for you to focus in on, What has the supervision that you've had and that you've received been like? What is it like now? I believe quite strongly that practice educators often don't get great supervision about their practice education role. It's almost like just something that you go away and get on with. So what kind of supervision are we receiving is important for us to think about. Now, if you were at the last session, you'll remember I talked about this framework quite a lot. I talked about the importance in social work of the what, why, and how framework. How what we do as social workers should be, when we're going out to see somebody, we should be thinking about what's happening for this person. Why has this situation come about? How can I work with them to bring about improved outcomes? And I shared, I'm not going to spend long on this because we did it a lot last time, but we talked a lot about the importance of this what, why, and how framework. Last time I shared the way in which I believe that the why question has fallen off the agenda for lots of us. It's become much more about what's happened, how do I deal with it, what's going on, how do I respond? And we're losing the why from our professional framework. But as I say, I talked about this a lot last time, so I'm not going to talk about it very much this time, other than to say that what I'm hoping is that by the end of today's session, you feel that we've explored together what do we mean by supervision in a virtual world? Why is it important? Why are there some specific issues about doing this virtually? And how might we improve the supervision that we provide in a virtual world? So that you can always take away from every session that you do with me, hopefully, a what, a why, and a how. And actually, research in supervision talks about the importance of that very what, why, and how framework. So David Wilkins, who is based at the University of Cardiff, they do a lot of work there on looking at supervision. And David Wilkins did, he did quite a bit of research of supervision that took place across London. So I don't know if any of your supervision sessions might have been included in this research, but he listened in. So there were audio recordings of lots of supervision sessions in a number of London boroughs. And he listened back to it, and his research team listened back to it. And in one of the papers that they wrote, they've written quite a few papers about their supervision research, but in one of the papers in 2018, the research team talked about how to decide whether or not they thought that the supervision sessions were practice focused as well as reflective, they considered 3 questions. They looked at, after listening to that audio tape, do we know what the social worker is going to do in the next home visit to that family or in the next few home visits? Do we understand why the social worker is going to do those things? And do we understand how they're going to do them? So really what they were looking at was, has this discussion helped the social worker to think more carefully about what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and why they're going to do it? And from my perspective, that's what I always want a student to be able to take away from supervision with me, that we've explored what is happening for this family, why is it happening, how is it going to impact on the child or the adult or the family? And then I want the student to leave feeling that they know what they're going to do, why they're going to do it, and how they're going to do it. So the what, why, how for me is the golden thread of supervision. That's a phrase that's used quite a lot, the golden thread of supervision. Coming out of David Wilkins' research, you'll see that phrase a lot in the literature. But sometimes, to me, it feels a bit like that old story, The Emperor's New Clothes. What is the golden thread? Everybody talks about the golden thread, but no one actually really says, this is what it is. To me, the golden thread is the what, the why, and the how. So I kind of wanted to start us off with that, but just remember that this is what David Wilkins and his research team were looking at. Do we know the session is practice focused? And that's how they were using the what, the why, and the how. So going into that golden thread, for me, the golden thread today that's going to tie together what we're going to talk about this afternoon is the letter P. It's being stitched there, look, on the illustration in golden thread, the letter P. So the alternative title for today is looking at the P that sits in that golden thread in the middle of supervision. For me, the alternative title for today is Supervision, All the Ps. I mean, we're in the midst of a global pandemic, so I thought, why not? Let's throw in the letter P. And what I'm going to ask you to do is think about how many words beginning with the letter P can you think of that relate to supervision? So I'm going to ask you now just to type in the chat box any words that begin with the letter P that you think relate to supervision. So what words can you think of relating to supervision beginning with the letter P? Type down as many of those as you can think of in the chat, because we're going to use those in the session as we go along. So I'm trying to make this as interactive as possible, even though, as we heard earlier, the decision was made, and I think it works, it's better technologically. But as Chris was explaining earlier, the decision for you to not have your cameras and microphones on, which does make it smoother for people to listen to, but to try and make it interactive, I'm asking you to type into the chat box as many words that you can think of that begin with the letter P that relate to supervision. So in a way, what you're doing is you're typing in, what do you think we're going to cover today? What words? Because everything we cover today will begin with the letter P. So I've got a number of words beginning with the letter P that relate into supervision and possibly connect us into that global and virtual world. So I can't read the chat at the moment because I'm concentrating on sharing my screen. But what I can see is I can see that the number of things written in the chat has gone up really swiftly. So I'm hoping there's lots of words beginning with the letter P. Chris said he would take a look at those, as are the other panelists. And as we go through, they're going to keep an eye on, are there any words beginning with the letter P that I don't talk about in the presentation and we can come back to? So first word that I have that starts with the letter P, let's see if it's in the chat already. The first word that I have beginning with the letter P connects what I've already said just in the first few minutes, and that is purpose. The P of purpose. There is a real need for clarity about the purpose of supervision. And in the group of students that I've just worked with recently, one of those students, unfortunately, I recommended a fail for that placement. And that was actually largely, there were some other issues, but it was largely about the student's use of supervision. And it made me very reflective about whether or not I'd been clear enough about the purpose of supervision. What is supervision for? Why do we do supervision, if you like? And in many ways, it's the what, the why, and the how. The purpose sits in the middle. So I talked about the importance of the what, why, how framework for me in social work, and I've been using that through my whole career as social workers. Simon Sinek, who is seen as, I think he's described as a guru. I don't quite know what you have to do to become a guru, but he's described as a guru in the world of leadership, management and leadership. He has the most popular TED Talk of all time. I don't know if any of you watch TED Talks, but apparently his TED Talk is the most popular of all time. And that TED Talk is titled Start with Why. He's written a couple of books, global bestsellers. One is called Start with Why. The next one is called Find Your Why. Essentially, what he says is the why we do something matters because it influences how we do it and it influences what people think it is. So the why sits centrally. From my perspective, social work has why at both the start and at the heart of our practice. So the why is essential in terms of supervision. What's the purpose of supervision? Why are we doing it? And so that makes me revisit what's actually now seen as kind of, I suppose, in a way, just core material that we talk about in terms of supervision. Many local authorities still use the 4x4x4 integrated model of supervision developed by Toni Morrison. In there, Toni Morrison talks about 4 functions of supervision. And those functions of supervision have been huge in terms of supervision training, the delivery of supervision, supervision policies, our understanding of supervision. And I've tried to summarize the functions of supervision in this table, but I've tried to seat that around the why, the what, and the how, if you like. So why do we do supervision? We do supervision to ensure competent, accountable practice. We do supervision to encourage continuing professional development. We do supervision to offer personalised support, and we do it to help engage the practitioner with the organisation. The function that's associated with that is managerial, because that helps us to ensure competent, accountable practice, developmental, supportive, and mediation. There are 4 functions of supervision, and all of the literature that you look at will refer to these 4 functions of supervision. Some people would say to you the functions are the why. I would say the functions are the what are we doing, really, and they meet the reasons why. Whatever, whether we see the functions as the what or the why, the important thing is, how does the student experience supervision? The student should have space in which to discuss their practice and to reach decisions with support of a more experienced practitioner, a practice educator. The student should experience a level of shared decision making, and there should be clearly agreed levels of accountability. The student needs to have the opportunity for reflective discussion to enable their learning and development. They should receive personalised support with the challenges of the role. And I think that's particularly important at the moment during the pandemic. We talked last time, if people were here last time, if you remember, we talked about the concept of moral injury and how good quality, emotionally supportive, reflective supervision helps to mitigate the impact of moral injury. Students need to have space to discuss the emotional context of the practice that they're involved in. But it is important to recognise supervision isn't a counselling session. So there are boundaries to this emotional support. We need to have a balance there, with the boundaries being well maintained. But supervision should feel fully supportive. The student should also feel that their supervisor has an understanding of their role as a student, and the supervision session should help them to mediate the roles of learner and practitioner. So I suppose that's about sort of mediating, acting as a bridge between what's being learned at university and what's happening in practice. How does that kind of come together? That whole element of learning for practice and practice learning, and how do we bring those together? So that's, I suppose, the basis of what supervision is about, what the purpose is about. What I'd say to you is that some supervisors, and again, maybe you want to think here as you're all sitting, think about the supervision that you receive. Those functions sit not just in terms of practice education, but those functions should be there for everybody. So we should all experience those things. Those functions should be there for all of us. Unfortunately, some poor quality supervision, supervisors feel like if they throw in a couple of questions, they've met the functions. So they start off by asking, how are you feeling? And then tick off in their head, I've done the supportive function now, I've asked how they're feeling. And then halfway through, or maybe sometimes a bit rushed towards the end, the supervisor will throw in, any training you've done recently? Any training you'd like to go on? And then they tick off in their head, I've done the developmental function now. The functions are not met by simply asking a single question. You don't ask a question and tick off one of the functions of supervision. In fact, supervision should feel it meets all of those functions. And at this point, I'm just going to ask Louise. I know, unfortunately, Louise's camera isn't working today, but if you were here last time, you'll remember that I was joined by Grace as a local practice educator who shared her thoughts. And today, Louise is going to share her thoughts as a practice educator working within the partnership. And I know, Louise, you wanted to share some of your thoughts around the purpose of supervision, didn't you?
Yeah, so it was just because I think when Dloos started his placement, we were sort of, we met up in the office and we were thinking about the placement in general, but and supervision, and it's working in partnership to agree, that we're agreeing on supervision, because what might work for me might not necessarily work for Dloos. just again, like what you've covered a lot of it, so make sure that it remains sort of purposeful, supportive, but obviously keeping those boundaries in, and how can we use supervision in a virtual world, because we're not face to face, so we're not getting like the social cues, the body language, things like that. And how can we also use supervision then to sort of assess, because we're not out and about together like we would normally be, so it's use the purposeful as well, using supervision to support Dloos, like so accountability for practice, his reflection on sort of what he's doing, why he's doing it, and how he's going to do it, and those reflections, and then bringing in theory into those conversations as well. So I think we've had to be quite creative in sort of how we do supervision and the purpose of it, just to make sure that Dloos getting everything that he needs to support him and his development, and making sure that I'm getting everything that I need to be able to assess Dloos properly.
I agree, Louise, and I think you've brought in a really interesting point there, that supervision has always been about enabling learning and development for students, but it's also a key aspect of where we do our assessment as practice educators. But I think more so during the pandemic, I don't know if you've found this, but when I was working this summer, if I compare that to when I've worked with students previously, I think I based a lot more of my assessment of the student on what happened within supervision. Because as you were saying, the other things, the driving in the car together to places, those kinds of things, we'd lost that. So I was much, much more reliant, I think, on supervision. So I suppose that clarity of the purpose of supervision is to do all of these things. That's from the student's perspective, I suppose, isn't it? But from our perspective as the practice educator, one of the purposes is to assess whether this student is a competent social worker. So actually a clarity about that purpose and an openness about that purpose, I think, is really important. So I think that's a really important point. Thank you for sharing that, Louise. So I'm going to go now to another P. Now, this is a P I'm imagining. I hope that the word purpose appeared in the chat when we thought about the P's of supervision. I would be very surprised if the next P has shown up in the chat. However, I've subliminally tried to put this into position for you. If you remember, the opening slide was a social worker on a journey, standing at a signpost with loads of different things in loads of different arrows offering CPD and student and ASYE and practice educator, all of these different options that we have to us as social workers. It was all about our social work journey. But that social worker stood there holding something in their hand. And what they were holding in their hand was a passport. To me, supervision is the passport for the student's journey. It's really central in terms of social work journeys. From my perspective, there is no journey in social work without supervision. There's no journey without a passport, is there? You can't go on a long journey without a passport. At least you don't get very far without a passport. You don't experience new cultures, new climates, new contexts. Passports are really important. So for me, the analogy is that supervision acts as our passport, and the illustration there is taken from a workshop that I did with newly qualified social workers exploring supervision and their own use of supervision, where they made their own passports, and we talked about the use of a supervision passport. But I'm going to try and drill into the analogy. Why do I talk about supervision as a passport? And there's a number of reasons. Firstly, it's all about uniqueness. Just as a passport is unique to us, it's unique. My passport is different to your passport. Just as a passport is unique, so supervision should be uniquely tailored to that particular student. As Louise said, what works for one person won't work for another person. What I understand good supervision to be might be very different to what Dloos thinks good supervision is. So we need to share our understanding of what does supervision mean. And it should look, I hope, that every placement that I work on with a student, they experience and they feel like they've had a different experience of supervision, one which is unique to them. We also need to think about passport origins, and some people have 2 passports because they have dual nationality. It helps us to think about how do we address aspects of culture and identity in supervision. That also relates into the use of a passport. If you're as old as me, you'll remember the days where you used to get your passport stamped when you went to different countries. You used to stamp your passport as you went in. And that's almost a way of thinking about, I like to think about, a student can receive supervision from lots of different places. They could have a case conversation with the team manager. They could go and have a conversation if there's someone on the team who has a particular interest, say in carers assessments or in CHC, or they can go to that person and have a conversation about it. They can get their passport stamped in lots of different places so that they can experience informal supervision from some people, some group supervision, some peer supervision, lots of different supervision going on. Think about the worth of a passport, how much your passport costs if you lose it. You know, thinking about, do students really recognise the worth of supervision and give it the value that it should have? That's important. As is the state of a passport. If I had a look at my passport now, it's quite tatty around the edges, it's a bit curled up, you know, but actually when you get a new passport, the cover's like really inflexible, isn't it? It doesn't move. It's kind of like, no, this is how it is. Once you've had supervision for a while, you become a bit more flexible with it. You can kind of curl it at the edges a little bit. Think about, sometimes when you travel, you need a visa. Passport's not enough. You need a visa. You need some additional documentation to get in. I think it's really important for students to know that they need to arrive for supervision with all of the necessary documentation. I don't know if you've ever flown anywhere and stood behind someone in a queue where they're trying to fumble about to find the right boarding pass or the right bit of paper. It's so irritating when people have got bits of paper flying around everywhere. Turn up ready to travel. It's really important, isn't it? And if we can communicate that to students, you need to show up ready to travel. Otherwise, your passport's useless. That's really important. And then the final one is a double P, passport photos. I want you to think about your passport photo now. If I ask you to conjure up a picture of your passport photo in your mind's eye, what does it look like? I don't know anybody who ever's blown up their passport photo and stuck it up on the front wall in the front room because it's the best photograph they've got of themselves. Nobody does that. Because a passport photograph is so limited by rules, you can't do this, you can't wear a hat, you can't wear glasses, you can't smile, you can't, it's so limited, it limits us, it limits our identity, it limits who we are. So we need to think about supervision as enabling rather than limiting somebody's identity and somebody's who they are and how they operate. But I really do want to drill down into that passport photograph and what's not a good passport photograph. So I went on Google Images and I thought to myself, right, I'll just Google bad passport photo, and I thought I'd get like a silly picture that I could share and we could bring a bit of humor into the session and look at, here's a bad passport photo. But actually that isn't what you get. What you get if you Google bad passport photo is you actually get advice on how to take the right kind of passport photograph. And the image I'm just about to show you, when I did a Google image search on bad passport photo, this is what came up. It's actually from the Algerian embassy. So this is the advice from the Algerian embassy. You wouldn't think that's why I've written it on there to remind me on how to take the right kind of passport photo. And when I did a Google image search, this jumped out at me. It sat in the middle of my computer screen and it jumped at me straight away. This image. The Algerian embassy say you must not have your mouth covered by your hands, you must not have your eyes closed, and you must not have an unnatural facial expression or crying. That's the image that you mustn't have. And it captured me, firstly, because it's quite cute. But that looks like a day in social work to me, really. It's all of the emotions, isn't it? It's all of the emotions. Think about that as a student placement. The student starts off a bit like, oh, mouth covered by the hands, a bit anxious, a bit excited. Halfway through, oh, I'm not sure about this. And then at some point, there's going to be some tears about this placement. This whole thing, it's like the full gamut of emotions that we experience. And that's what, to me, is really important about supervision. Supervision has to provide us with a safe place to talk about, to learn about, to think about, and to reflect on. the emotional context of social work practice. I think it's David Howe who talks about social work is emotional labour, and it absolutely is. It's emotionally challenging all of the time, but more so now during a global pandemic. We need to provide students with the opportunity to explore those emotions, to think about those emotions. It's essential. The other reason that that photograph jumped out at me, it's not quite right, but it almost is: see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil. And that's really important just in terms of whistle blowing. Think about the importance of blowing the whistle in terms of, you know, if supervision is really poor quality in your local authority, in your area, it's really important, you know, so think about that kind of element of supervision too. But what I want you to think about in terms of that passport photograph is, how does the student see you in supervision? What does your photograph look like to them? And how do you see them? It's all about how we visualize people, how we see people, what matters, all of that stuff about difference and diversity, the social graces that we talked about last time. All of this is really important in that supervisory relationship. It's essential stuff. So passport photos and the passport of supervision is probably not one of the P's that you thought about, but you may have thought about the P of place. Thinking through where should supervision take place, and that is definitely changing at the moment. And I know, Louise, you wanted to share something here, didn't you? Your own thoughts about the place of supervision at the moment.
Yeah, it sort of made me think about how we do supervision now, where we're on a laptop, we're looking at each other, we're seeing our own faces, and just making sure that, I mean, if we're working at home, if we're working in the office, that our students they're feeling that it's a safe place for them, that they're able to talk. Because if they're in the office, or if it's a day when they're at home and their kids are at home and they're not at school, just being mindful of those sort of additional factors that might impact on the supervision, on their engagement, and just sort of being flexible with it as well. I think with Dloos and I, we said sort of at the beginning, okay, what would sort of be a good day? Because I'm mindful that supervision on a Friday afternoon it can be soul destroying. It really can. So we sort of thought, okay, Dloos suggested Thursday mornings. We're like, yep, that'll work. So we always try and stick to that. And just, and keep it in place. It's booked in right until the end of the placement. So we're not having to worry about, oh my gosh, we haven't got it booked in. We know where we're going to be on a Thursday. We know that what time it's going to be at and sort of what's going on.
Yeah, I love that. I love the way you think about place really creatively as well there. So not just about the space that it takes place in, but also placing supervision centrally to your week and keeping that time, and having that kind of ring fence time on a Thursday morning, I think is really important, because it can mean, I know if you do supervision at a different time each week, sometimes you look at when are we going to have it next week, and then both of you have got your calendars full, you can't combine it. So actually having a set time. But as I would always say, I would say never a Monday morning and never on a Friday afternoon, because they're like just the times that you just don't want to have supervision. So, but yeah, you're completely right about place in that, Louise. And it kind of takes us to where we're having supervision now, takes us into the other P's, which is the pedagogy P's, the 4 P's that are taken from social pedagogy. And they are not P's like this, but P words, 4 words. All of us, according to social pedagogy, all of us have these 4 P's about us. We all have a private self. We all have a personal self, a professional self, and a public self. The private self is the self that we don't share with anybody but our most intimate private partner in life. Our personal self is the self that our family and our friends know. Our colleagues know bits about our personal self, what we like to watch on the telly, what we do at weekends. That's a bit of our personal. And then we've all got a professional self, which is our self at work. And the public self is if you're on social media, you know, that's your public self, or maybe just how you see, Google yourself, what is your public image? You know, look at that. That's your different P's. And Louise, I think you're spot on, totally right, that what we're doing here is we're doing a professional activity. Supervision is a professional activity, but we're doing it in personal spaces now. So these P's originally in social pedagogy are written about us as an individual. And I think we need to take into account these P's in supervision. So we'll talk to a student perhaps about some personal issues, but we never blur over into the private. So you've got these, they can help us to think about what we share, what we don't share. And I use the P's for all kinds of things in social work. But what I've realized is we could use the P's to think about space and place as well. So we are doing a professional activity in somebody's personal space. There's one of the students that I worked with, and we had a bit of a laugh about it this year, but I think I've been in every room in her house virtually. Sometimes whenever we do supervision, she'd turn up in a different room and I'd, oh, I like that wallpaper. Oh, hang on a minute, that's different to last week. I think literally other than the bathroom, I've been in every room in this student's house. I've met students' dogs, students' cats, students' children. I mean, literally everything, because you're taking place. You're coming into somebody's personal space. We can see Dloos. Look, I think it's a fabulous picture that you've got on the wall behind you there, Dloo, but we can see that. We can see into your home. And that's very different. I would never have done that before. We would never have done those things in the way in which we used to work. We'd have gone off into a room, but it would have been a professional space. Now there's a blurring around these boundaries. And you know, I really liked what you were saying there, Louise, about what if children are at home? We've got to think about that. If children are at home, how are we dealing with that? One of the students that I worked with had a young child and had 1 day a week, no childcare and no options for childcare. And we had an agreement that we would do supervision on that day, because then the other days she was free to be able to go out and do visits and have meetings and things. And this one day where she had a daughter with her who was quite young, we said we'd do supervision that day. And a daughter would pop up on the screen. We'd start off and a mum would say to her, this is my teacher. And I would say, this is what I want you to do today, I'd say to the little girl. And a mum would have prepared something for her to do. And I would tell her over the screen, now, you're going to go off and do that. And then I want you to show it me at the end. And that would keep her busy. And she would bring me back a coloured in picture or something that she'd made at the end of supervision and show it me on screen. I would never have thought that I would be engaged in something like that. But that's what we agreed that would work to enable supervision that wasn't disturbed. And it worked really, really well. But you could say, well, what about the boundaries there? What about that? But this is about creativity in enabling people to continue to work and study through a pandemic. So these P's merge a bit. And we do need to think about that in terms of the space and place of supervision. Another P I'm going to take you on to relates again into a journey. Instead, not a passport this time, but instead postcards. I actually have a method that I've used for many years now. I've probably used this for about the last 10 years, where I ask students to start supervision off with a postcard. It's kind of a restorative activity of a check-in. So the student has some postcards. I used to just have a box of old postcards that I'd collected from all over the place. More recently, I've developed a set of postcards so that it has everything in there that people might want to use, but you can do it in either way. So I give the student some postcards at the beginning of placement, and they bring a postcard to start off each supervision. So they start off by saying, here's how I'm feeling on my journey, and they'll share the postcard and they'll talk about why they've chosen that postcard, what it means to them. It's a really good way of looking at, then we look back at the end of the journey, we look back at over all of the postcards. What do these postcards show about growth and progress along the way? The social work postcards also, you can turn them over. They have a reflective question on the back. It really just opens up the conversation in a reflective way. So it gives you a reflective opening to supervision. This is taken from one of the students that I worked with during this year's placement. And these are her postcards that she brought to the beginning of each supervision session. it's really interesting to look at the growth across the placement and how her placement progressed for her and all of that. But she stuck them up on the wall where she was working. And it is interesting because this time, because I've been doing them virtually, I thought, shall I just ask them to bring a virtual picture? And I did that with 2 students as a trial. And with the other students, I sent them postcards. The ones who had physical postcards said they loved the activity. They had to search through the postcards to start off with, choose a postcard, bring it to supervision. We did have a funny thing where one of them she used to like to have a background for it, and whenever she held up the postcard, she would disappear. You know, you've seen that happen on when people have a background. That was always quite comical. But they liked to bring a physical postcard. The other 2, I said, just bring an image, and it didn't work as well for them. And I think it's because they'd go into Google Images and put feeling a bit stressed and just see what came up. So it comes from a different space. But the key thing about the postcard choice is to recognize different people see different things in the same images. So I want to tell you about this particular postcard here. This doesn't sit in the set of social work postcards, but this is a postcard that I used to use. When I said to you before there was a set of particular social work postcards, then I used to just collect postcards wherever I went. To start with, I would spend ages in a postcard shop choosing a particular postcard, thinking this will represent such and such a thing. And then no one ever chose it to represent what I thought it represented. So I gave up and I just gather postcards wherever I went. And I picked this one up. I think it was in a charity shop in Iceland. I'd been to speak at a conference over there, and I got a big bundle of postcards in a charity shop. And when I got home, I unwrapped them and I saw this one. And I thought, oh, shall I get rid of this? Shall I not bother using it? I don't know. I don't know what to do. Will it be useful? And so I threw it into I used to have a training box of postcards. I'd have a separate box for students and a box for when I was doing training. And I'd lay out the postcards on training because I use postcards in lots of different ways. And probably twice a week, I'd lay them out. I used to stick them up all over walls or lay them out all over tables, loads and loads of postcards. And I laid this postcard out a couple of times a week for 3 years, and no one ever picked it. It was a tatty postcard when I got it. No one ever picked it. That's how it looked. But then this happened one day, and I'm going to tell you the story of it to show how different people see different things in the same postcard. And that's how you use it with students. So it was a big training event. It was a huge teaching partnership event, actually, and there were about 100 people in the room, and postcards up all over, literally surrounding the room. And we did a quick activity with these postcards where I asked people, choose one postcard that represents where you are now, and then another postcard of where you want to be in 6 months' time, and then bring it back and explain it to your partner. So that's what they did. And I saw this young woman go and pick this postcard up off the wall. You should have seen me trying to listen into what is she going to say about this postcard. No one's ever chosen this postcard before. What's she going to say? And this is what she said. She turned the postcard over, and I saw the woman sitting next to her look quite shocked when this postcard showed up. And this is what she said. She said, I'm a newly qualified social worker. When I started my ASYE year, I was told I was going to be given a protected caseload. She said, what I think is protection and what my manager thinks is protection, we might as well be speaking to each other in an entirely foreign language. The back of the postcard is all in a foreign language. I assume Icelandic, I don't know. She said, when I was a student, I felt like I was really well protected by my practice educator. She said, in fact, my practice educator, I'd describe her like a giant condom. She just kept me safe from everything. She said, in fact, it was like being double bagged because I had a practice supervisor as well. So it was like wearing 2 condoms. I felt really, really safe in everything I did. Now I'm qualified. She said, I feel like the condoms burst. I could be spreading all kinds of viruses in my practice. I don't feel safe anymore where I am. That is exactly how she described herself using this postcard image. Then she talked about the postcard where she wanted to be in 6 months' time. And then her partner said back to her, as the exercise is, shared back what she saw in the postcard. And this person said, when you turned that postcard over, I had no idea what I was going to say or even what you were going to say about that postcard. She said, but the first thing I thought was, I've never seen a green condom with legs on it. And when you talked to me about what you thought and why you'd chosen that postcard, she said, I totally get it. I totally get that you feel now that you're not safe. She said, but to me, this is what this postcard says. To me, this postcard says, this is the first time that you're having to kind of take your own sort of first steps into the world of social work. And you're just kind of finding your feet really in social work. Maybe you feel a bit green or a bit naive in your practice. She said, but to me, and this is what she said, exactly her words. She said, excuse my language, but she said, I don't like social workers who are too cocky about their own practice. Some social workers are very cocksure of themselves and they're overconfident. She said, what I like is professional humility. And what you're showing in the way you talked about your practice was professional humility. You know what you don't know. You know what you want to ask of people. She said, and maybe after listening to you, I think perhaps your practice educator and your practice supervisor were a bit overprotective towards the end of your social work training. But here to me, this seems like a really safe space for you to be, because you're going to go and ask what you don't know. Now, that was a way of seeing the same postcard in an entirely different way, but that really helped that newly qualified worker to see things differently. And what's really important is to recognise that we see things not as they are, but we see things as we are. If you remember when we did the last webinar, we looked at reflexivity and that need for self-awareness in reflection, and these postcards really assist with that. Feedback from a student about using postcards. I found choosing a weekly postcard helped me to reflect honestly. It's helped me to tune into and to prepare for supervision. I've been able to express my feelings and emotions through a wide range of images. For me, looking at pictures, I felt that they were able to represent my feelings and my learning at that point in the journey, perhaps more than I could have done in words. In addition, the postcards gave me a platform from which to discuss any issues. And by sharing the postcard at the start of supervision, I felt Siobhan was able to prompt discussion about how I was feeling, and in some circumstances, help me to see things differently. So postcards are really helpful at providing emotionally supportive supervision in a creative way. So it's something I'd suggest, if you've not tried it before, give it a go. It is a really good activity to do. If you don't like the idea of postcards, I mean, you have to try it to see if it works. It does really work. If you don't like the idea of postcards, choose something else. Choose an object. One of the things I've been doing a lot during online training, if I'm doing a full training day, is a kind of scavenger hunt thing. And I'll say to people, I did a session yesterday where I said, go on, everyone was working from home. I said, take 10 minutes away from the screen, because we need to do that every now and again, and go and find an object that to you represents what a good manager looks like. And then they came back and talked about it. And it really enables talking from a different place. When you engage somebody's picture-based thinking or creative-based mind, it engages things in a different way. So you could start supervision by bringing an object to share at the start of supervision that says, how are you feeling? The reason I use postcards is because postcards are about how we communicate journeys, and it helps you to look at all of the postcards put together at the end, helps you to think about and reflect on the whole journey. But use something, have an opener that goes beyond how are you feeling, because how are you feeling doesn't really take you anywhere. This takes you into a reflective conversation at the start of supervision. So postcards is another P. Another P, one I'm sure that you will have put into the chat, planning and preparation. We talked last time about the need to reflect for action, to plan ahead, to think through things. My own way of working is I write into learning agreements that I'm doing for placements with students, and I'm an off-site practice educator, but I write into learning agreements that students should be given the same amount of time to prepare as they spend in supervision. So if a student's going to have 2 hours in supervision weekly, I want them to also have that 2 hours to prepare for supervision. I don't want to be having a student who doesn't have the time to prepare for what I'm doing with them in supervision. And that's really important. And it became particularly important during the recent placements where I'm asking students to do lots of things to prepare for supervision. And I spent my own kind of planning is I spent ages planning how would I do supervision in a virtual world with these students, not least just the technology and how's it going to work. But we know these phrases, don't we? That poor preparation leads to poor performance. I would say poor preparation leads to a poor placement, and it leads to poor quality supervision. So let's take a think about how do we do all of this and what we've been talking about, all of the things around supervision. How do we do it all in a virtual world? So most of what we've talked about so far today relates to supervision generally. But how do we do this in a virtual world? Because these webinars are all about new ways of working. How do we work through the pandemic? How do we work virtually? So really thinking about how do we do supervision like this just on a camera. As Louise said, you have to get used to seeing yourself on camera and how that feels, but thinking that through. And for me, I was thinking about how can I best support the student's journey in a virtual world? But actually, rather than me tell you that, I'm going to hand over to Dloos, who is going to bring the student's perspective. For me, what's really central to learning about new ways of working is to hear from students themselves about what's working in placements and maybe what isn't working so much. So Dloos has very kindly agreed to contribute to today's session and share his perspective. So at this point, I'm going to mute myself, Dloos, and hand over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan. So let me start with, I've worked 20 years in social care, and so I've had quite a lot of experience of supervision. Some of it good, some of it not so good. But I suppose my thoughts of pre-lockdown supervision is my supervisor will always be a manager. Supervision always happens at work, often in a box room, sometimes in an open planned office. It's prone to distractions, interruptions from colleagues. There's always someone wanting something signed, or there's always an emergency. My supervisor might be sitting there scribbling away or behind a laptop tapping. Also, my supervisor will ask me questions, and I'll know the answers to those questions, but I'll freeze, and I'll sit there and I'll go, I know this, but I don't want to appear stupid, so I'll stay quiet. And then I feel guilty and shameful about it, and my supervisor's looking at me, and I start thinking, wait a minute, is this a performance thing? Oh, you know, and so there's a bit of dread going on. Also, I hate sitting down, and as I'm talking, I'm sort of moving around, and just sitting in supervision, I feel like I'm being contained in this space where I've got all these thoughts and emotions going, but I can't do anything physical with it. And so there's a struggle there. Also, supervision tends to be lots of caseloads, lots of risk, and it's almost like the more risk there is, the more concern there is, the longer my supervision goes. So I think when I started, my supervision might have started off to be maybe an hour, pretty relaxed, and has my experiences or the roles that I had got more intense. So I did the supervision. I think before I left, I was doing 2-day supervisions a month, which seems crazy when I think about it, but that's because this is the idea of management oversight. So my thoughts on supervision pre-COVID, you know, I'll sum it up in one word. I think the word summoned would be my feeling. Also, I remember 2 conversations with supervisors. Well, not 2 conversations. Walking into supervision for the first time, my supervisor at the time sort of might as well have embraced me and said something along the lines of, I'm so grateful I'm supervising you, I'll have little work to do. And that made me feel really sort of trusted. Equally, I had a supervisor, when she left, she spoke to someone I knew and shared that I was really difficult to supervise. And so somewhere I've got these 2 sort of thoughts in my head about what happens when I have supervision. So in terms of lockdown and being a student, obviously I've shifted from being someone that might have held cases to now being a student. And I see some big differences. Mainly, I'm holding fewer cases and I have more time to reflect. I think one of the impacts of lockdown, or the biggest impact I feel, was this idea that I've lost out on the office culture. I've lost the opportunity to have those informal conversations with colleagues where I'd often brainstorm. I'd also be able to unpick ethical dilemmas. And I'd also get the chance to ask lots of silly questions and then keep asking them and keep asking them and keep asking them. And I've lost all that. And so there's this massive void that needs filling. So I think I found myself in a place where I'm pretty receptive to want to talk to people about work. And that's where supervision comes in there. So my experience of supervision in placement is, and I'm not sure if it's on the slide, Siobhan, but it's peaceful. And I think that's much needed. I think that there's a lot of stuff that's going on personally, at work and stuff. And it's a place that needs to be peaceful to be able to unpick all the problems that we might be dealing with. I think it's important that, I found it important that my practice educator is a social worker and not a manager. As I said, I'm carrying fewer cases, and so I have more time to reflect on stuff, and there's a lot of sort of trial and error. We're also focusing on my development as opposed to just simply talking about what's happening, what you're going to do to fix it. So there's also so with Louise being a social worker, whilst there's a clear power difference between us, in my experience, I think when I came into supervision, I probably didn't have a great first semester at uni and with my placement, and there was a lot of anxiety. And so I think we spent the whole of that supervision just talking through what was going on. And there was very little time spent on the actual what we would be doing. And I found that really refreshing because it actually was the support that I needed. And it felt like I was being trusted, which is really important. If I think of all the good supervisors I've had, I think probably the best supervisor I had did a really good thing, which was to every so often do the thing about checking in on how she was as a supervisor to me, and that's really refreshing because it's my space. I'm going into a space where I'm talking to someone about issues that I need to kind of understand, and so it's really important that they are checking in, that they're actually meeting my needs. So supervision. So what I like about supervision in the virtual world is that because I'm not in an office, I can do whatever I want. So in our supervisions, I think I do stuff like I do the washing up, and it's really nice being able to do the washing up whilst I'm having supervision, because I've got this energy that I'm using up, but also I'm completing the household chore. So I'm doing two things at once, and it's like there's nothing more refreshing than to realise, to see the fact you've actually done something that you're probably putting off whilst working. It's a bit of a, I don't know, it makes me feel better. Also, it's this thing about when we're in supervision, I can go out to the park and walk, and I'm getting fresh air, and I'm again using up this energy. There's a thing about there's fewer interruptions. There are no interruptions now, whereas before people would be dropping in. Also, when I think that I need to answer those difficult questions, I've got my laptop in front of me, so I can go straight into our computer system. I can check up on Google. I'm no longer stupid, or I no longer feel that I'm stupid. I'm really empowered, and I'm finding stuff, and it's making me feel more confident as a person and as a practitioner. And that's it.
Thanks ever so much, Dloos. That was really interesting. I tell you, it's interesting, isn't it, that we have preconceived ideas that we as practice educators probably think, oh, supervision, students won't be as happy with supervision in a virtual world. But actually, what you're saying is there's loads of advantages to it from your perspective, and it's really good to hear that. And from my perspective, I wasn't thinking about doing the washing up during supervision, I'm thinking, oh, I don't know what I think about that. And I'd really need to have some time to reflect on that, because all the sessions I've done, even though they've been virtual, we've been on camera and we've both still sat. But I actually quite like the idea of that physicality as well, of movement whilst you're doing supervision, because I think that can be really helpful with reflection. So I've learned a lot from listening to you there, Dloos. So thank you for that. That was great. Thanks for preparing that as well. And that's definitely evidence for PCF domain 9, isn't it? You've got to take that through into your domains 1 and 9 evidence there, haven't you? So thank you for sharing that with us. Chris, I'm just going to come to you and see, is there anything in the chat at the moment that you want to respond to other than the P words? I want to come back to the P words. I'm hoping you're ticking them off as you're going along, and you've got a...
I've been very diligent in keeping a tally of all the P words.
Great.
So yes, I'll be able to report back later. I mean, just I don't think there are any particular questions, but a comment about maybe use of text and texting. And I was thinking about, for myself, my own use of chat in Twitter has been, sorry, not in Twitter, in Teams has become quite important for me, and kind of being able to hold conversations in different formats, not just the kind of conversational audio conversation, but actually conversations that are kind of truncated in that kind of short form of chat messages, which somehow seems to be more accessible and less sort of swamped by the enormous number of emails. So for now, chat has become quite a good way of cutting through the large number of email traffic, the amount of email traffic, and being able to get straight to the things that really matter, and to be able to resolve things quite quickly.
Yeah.
Let me have a quick look. There's a comment about finding people, and this I think resonates with some of the things that you've been saying, finding people able to be more brave and honest in an online space, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. I do think that there are a number of advantages to this, that sometimes we're looking at all of this quite negatively, but I think there's a number of advantages to working in this new way, new ways of working. So okay, so that actually maybe then takes us on to the next point, the next P. Well, actually there's two. I'm going to skip. I'm going to jump one ahead and say there's a positive, that actually one of the P's is positive. Let's keep things positive. And I do feel that lots of practice educators, maybe because we're used to our ways of working, when we've been challenged into these new ways of working, we've seen them as not so good. Oh, it's not as good to have supervision over a camera. Whereas actually what Dloos just said is, I'm actually loving new ways of working. So I think we need to keep things positive. I suppose the positivity part is also about critical reflection. And we looked at this last time, but critical reflection is often misunderstood as being about criticizing practice or being self-critical about your practice. We need to make sure that we support students to maintain a positive, optimistic approach to reflection in supervision, so that we keep the balance. And I think that's as much for us as it is for students, thinking about the positives of practice, thinking about the positives of current circumstances is important. And we're now trying to see the positives. Chris sharing with us the positives about the use of chat, Dloos talking about the positives of virtual working. I want to share with you, in the way Dloos has just shared, I think we learn a lot from hearing about situations, and I think we have I've got a real feel for you now, Dloos. In my mind, I've got a picture of you washing the pots and juggling everything all at the same time in supervision. I think it's a brilliant image. I'm going to try and get that drawn up somehow. This drawing illustrates my pivotal moment in terms of learning about kind of the online nature of supervision. Having been providing supervision for 27 years, but always in person, for me, this was a huge challenge. How do I do this on a computer screen? And as I said, I spent hours planning and preparing, how am I going to do these placements, because they're so different. And then this happened to me. This is my pivotal moment. This image is supposed to represent it. I actually, after it, wrote a blog about this situation along with the student that was involved, and you can read the blog if you want to. Some people have said they've really learned from that sharing, because again, the student shares it from her perspective. So this is what happened. I'm in supervision with the students, all going well, sitting on a computer screen like this. You're looking at yourself. I have myself as small as I can, and I have the student as big as I can when I, you know, the view that you can set up. So the whole of my computer screen is basically the student's face, and I'm talking away to the student, and I asked her a question, and I said something along the lines of, and how does that make you feel? And she started to cry, and I didn't know what to do. I went into a panic. I just thought, what do I do? Because ordinarily, when a student cries, I reach into my bag, I pull out a tissue, I give them a tissue. If it's a lot, I might go and make them a cup of tea. I'll come back, I'll sit with the person quietly, just to show I'm with them. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't shove a tissue through the computer screen. I was tempted to say, oh, let's finish and I'll leave you a bit. But then I don't want to leave you on your own crying. I don't want to say, do you want to go and make yourself a cup of tea, because the rest of your family that are in the house are going to see you crying. I didn't know what to do. And in that moment, everything went through my head. And I've got to say, I think I dealt with it really badly. I wittered. I totally wittered, because I was just, what should I do? I'll just keep talking. And I just talked constantly about kind of not even sure what I was talking about. But it was very emotionally challenging for me, because I wanted to be there to support this student and I couldn't be. And I really did kick myself afterwards, because I thought, why on earth, Siobhan, did you not anticipate that? Every student I've ever worked with, and I do have a couple of friends who say to me, you shouldn't say this, people might think, what do you do to students? But pretty much every student I've ever worked with will cry at some point during a placement. It's not something that I do. It's just about, I ask about feelings a lot. And it's challenging, isn't it, being a student? And goodness me, it's challenging all the more when you're in a global pandemic and you're worrying about yourself and your family and all of the anxiety that's going on. So why did I not anticipate this student might cry? I'd thought about all of the practicalities of using a virtual world, and I'd just not thought about the emotional context of supervision. And what will I do when a student cries? And it was actually really hard work, because the student, it's the whole screen focused on the face. What I realized was, it's different than if you're in a room together. If you're in a room together, you kind of see the whole body. If you're watching someone on Teams, the focus is just on their face. And I actually saw the tears coming before they came. You know, I kind of almost anticipated before the student did that she was going to cry. And it was really challenging. It was really difficult. And to cut a very long story short, the way I dealt with it was, I did witter, which was really bad. But then I thought, use some humour, Siobhan. So I told her this story that is what I normally tell when I'm doing training about supervision and practice education, and it's a story that always brings a giggle to people. So I thought, if I say the story, it'll make her laugh, and it'll also help her to realize she's not on her own in crying during supervision, because she thought, she was like, oh, I've cried, I'm going to fail, you know, it was terrible from her perspective. So I told her the story about a student that I was working with many years ago now, very early in my practice education career, and she was one of the first students that I'd worked with, and she started to cry. This particular person went on to become an assistant director of social work. So it didn't hold her back, did it? But she started to cry. I didn't know what to do. I reached into my bag to pull out a tissue, and I was rifling around in my bag and there was no tissue. I was conscious that the room that we were in was almost entirely glass. So everybody in the team room would have seen that this person was crying. At the time, she was sitting with her back to the team room, so they couldn't see, but she was crying and crying and crying. And it was really ugly crying, you know, snotty crying. It was really everywhere. It wasn't just a bit of a gentle tear. There was loads of tears. So I'm rifling, I couldn't find a tissue. And again, I went into a panic, and I was wearing a really nice scarf around my neck. And for some reason, I just thought to myself, I'll give her my scarf. I don't know what I thought she was going to do, but I took the scarf off and I gave her the scarf, and she blew her nose on this really nice scarf I was wearing and went to give it me back. Now, whenever I tell that story, it brings a smile and a bit of a giggle. I said to it, you can keep the scarf, it's yours. And then for a few years afterwards, she used to send me a scarf every Christmas, like as a bit of a joke. It was a funny thing between us. But I said, you know, she cried, and everybody cries at some point. She went on to become an assistant director. It doesn't hold you back. Don't feel bad. I used that humour, and I suppose that's what I did. But it really created a pivotal moment for me about thinking about the emotional context of working from home and how we deal with that on supervision. And if you want to read that blog, it's just on my website. It's really interesting from the student's perspective about how she felt when she was crying, and I write about how I felt when she was crying, and we pull it together. So just think that one through. I suppose that's also important in terms of the emotional context of practice. And then the next P that I'm going to think about is plenty, which is really about saying how much supervision should there be. I personally think a student should have 2 hours a week or so of supervision. I'm an off-site practice educator. I don't provide all of that. Sometimes I do supervision one week, the supervisor does it the next week. This last group of students I worked with, because there was a number of them, I did some group supervision as well as individual supervision. So how we did it was we did group supervision every week and individual supervision every other week. So I gave them more supervision than I normally would because of the pandemic. So just thinking through how much supervision should there be. The requirements are quite clear in social work that we should have weekly supervision for the first 6 weeks, fortnightly up to the 6-month qualification point, and then monthly once we're qualified. That's very clear that they should be the requirements. Now, whether or not that happens is another question, but that's what the requirements state should happen. I think, Louise, did you want to say something about the amount of supervision or the plenty?
Yeah, I was just thinking, it sort of made me think about being mindful of the supervision going on too long, because I've heard of some people saying it's going for like over 3 hours, and it's like that's too much. And just be mindful of like the impact of that on the student if it is very long, if it, if stress levels are high and people are overwhelmed. And I think this got me thinking about when I had my student before Dloos, and there was other students, and they would have had like their own group supervision, sort of they would have met once a month, and I don't, it would be really difficult now, I think, to do another supervision within a group that's virtual, because Dloos and I meet once a week, then we also have our team supervision. It sort of goes every other week, and we would have sort of like a consultation with one of the therapists that's attached to our team. Think about the kids that we're working with, and it goes back to the sort of the what and the why from the beginning. So it made me think about how do we know when it's too much, and how do we assess that together with the student?
Yes, I think you're spot on. How do we know what's too much? Because one of the students that I was working with over the summer, I'd already set up more supervision than I'd normally do. As I said, group every week and individual every other week. She had 2 practice supervisors. I'm not sure why, but that's what the team did. And one of those practice supervisors was being assessed for the first part of her practice educator award. So I think she said to me, the student, Jane, I think she said something like, I don't know, she'd had 100 supervision sessions or something during the placement. I mean, just too many. And how do we know that? How do we know when it is too much? As you said, I think that is important. So thanks for raising that. So in terms of supervision, the other P that I would use is think about peer supervisions. I mean, Louise, you've just mentioned having team supervision sessions and team conversations. I think that's really important. We've got a push in social work now, especially in terms of practice learning around intervision. And I don't know how consciously you use intervision in the teaching partnership. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it's on the slides there that really intervision is a kind of very specific form of peer group supervision. So it's, if you like, supervision is often translated as overseeing. I mean, it should be a lot more than that, but it's often translated as overseeing, whereas intervision is actually should be between seeing almost. So it's that group conversation. There should be, it needs to be chaired and it needs to be minuted, but that's rotated. It doesn't have one lead. So intervision is really important, and I think something that we could be, all of us, looking at and exploring. Another P that is really important is power. Liz Beddoe, whose work I really like, she's created an I don't know if you've seen it, it's freely available if you go into the SCOPT box, which is a really good resource for practice educators. I don't know how much you're using that. It's free. I would suggest everybody uses it. I use it a lot. In there, she's done an A to Z of supervision. It's a quick, it's a poster really of, let's just got a sentence or two on each letter. And I thought, oh, I'm going to do the P's with you today. I'll have a look at what Liz Beddoes' A to Z says on the P. And, you know, that makes sense. And her P was power. And it's so important, isn't it? And she says, in effective supervision, any power differentials between supervisors and supervisees is named and transparent. And a misuse of power sits behind a lot of harmful supervision. And I think that's really important. How do we clarify the power dynamics in supervision? It's really important. So I would encourage you and ask you to think about power within the supervisory role. I would ask you actually just to reflect on the flow of power. I mean, if you think about the different types of power, so even if we just separate it into just three: professional power, resource power, and the power to determine or make decisions. If we just look at how does power flow, say, between the student and the practice educator? The professional power sits with the practice educator because we're the one that's registered, we're the professional. Resource power sits with the practice educator. We know we can give access to learning resources for the student, learning opportunities, and we're the ones that make a recommendation about pass or fail or determining the outcome of this placement. That's not to say we hold all the power and you should be saying, I've got all the power. No. It's not like that. It's about just understanding the flow of power, that if we change that to the service user and the social worker or the student, the flow of power remains the same. So the student in their relationship with a service user holds the professional power, potentially holds the resource power and the power to determine, for example, whether somebody meets a criteria. So power is very fluid, it's very dynamic, it's not either or, it's changeable, it's movable, and we need to understand that. I would encourage you to just think about the construction of power. And that illustration there shows that power is about forms of power, levels of realms, spaces, sources, faces, and dimensions of power. There is a webinar that I did that's available on YouTube. Again, I can give you the link, that I did for students and practice educators, just looking at and exploring aspects of power. And you might want to watch that with students to explore them, to think about power and the fluidity of power in the social work relationships. So power is an essential one for you to think about and to consider. Another P, a key one for me, is relationships. But I was thinking, well, relationships doesn't begin with a P. What am I going to do with this? How am I going to get this in? So I've used PALS. It's not great, but it was the best way I could come up with for P. So critical friendships. Social work relationships are all about critical friendships. So introduced originally in the 1970s as a method to support action research, then what we know is that a critical friend, it's not someone that says, yeah, your bum does look big in that, yeah, you have put weight on in the lockdown, Siobhan. It's not that kind of critical friend. A critical friend is someone who asks you questions that make you think, who just takes you to places to explore that reflection. And that's what a practice educator should be for a student, is a critical friend. But equally, a student is a critical friend to a practice educator by asking, why do you do it like that? That critical friendship is central to the partnership between student and practice educator. And it is all about partnership working. And this person, whose name I can't pronounce, but I think, is it Flieger? But it's a Scandinavian name. But the P is another, because his name begins with a P. But he talks about 8 characteristics that define relationships-based supervision. And he says that relationship-based supervision is about creating safety and trust. It's about the mutuality of shared goals. It's having a shared goal, shared aims, commitment to growth and change, and a commitment to reflection. It's about having respect for one another. It's about the supervisor or the practice educator here being sensitive to the context of the working environment. It's about open communication, and it's about standards and ideals for the student to strive towards. Partnership is essential, key. relationships, but that's the way we can start relationships. With a P is about the partnerships and that critical friendships. So I'm rushing through the P's now. We don't have long to go, and I want to leave enough time at the end to see if there's any P's that you got that I didn't. So I'm going to go into praxis. Praxis is really just a fancy way of talking about connecting theory and reflection with practice. It's bringing together theory and research. It's in many ways, it's about building on the complexities of practice. Lindemann in 1944, this is the oldest quote we're ever going to get in, isn't it? But Lindemann says that praxis is education to be able to use. Praxis is education for use. That's what we should be doing. We should be teaching people what they can use in practice, and that's praxis. So another P I would suggest for supervision is the use of prompt cards. I use social work theory cards and reflective practice prompt cards in supervision. If I'm honest, I use reflective practice prompts a lot more than I use the theory cards in supervision, but that's my personal use. A lot of practice educators use theory cards in supervision. What I would say to you is, some people have said to me, how can we do that in the virtual world? If you have a set of prompt cards, either theory or reflective or both cards, as many practice educators do, what you need to know is that all students are able to access those online at the moment. So every student has free access to a website called Social Work Connect. They can email me and they get a free access to that through the whole of this year. Well, since the pandemic, it was for the whole of the year. So they've still got, 6 weeks left to use it. So just tell students to email me and ask for that resource. And it contains all of the theory cards and the reflective cards online. So you can say to a student, take a look at that online and come back and let's talk about it. So there is a way of you using the prompt cards, even though you're doing it virtually. So praxis is important, but a key aspect of praxis is asking questions, probing questions that prompt learning of students. And the key aspect to good quality supervision is asking probing questions. When Dloos was talking about being asked questions and feeling like I don't know the answer, well, I do know the answer, but I don't want to say because I feel stupid, or that really sort of captured me, because I was thinking, to me, a good supervisor asks questions rather than gives answers, and asks questions that really probes your learning and gets you to think, but in a safe space, in a safe way. And when I do observations of new practice educators who are perhaps doing their qualifications, one of the things that I find more than anything else is that practice educators sometimes give too many answers and don't ask enough questions. And actually, the skill lies in framing questions that prompt the learning of the student. And so what I thought I would do, because you're going to get these slides afterwards, is give you a bit of a resource here with some questions that are really useful probing questions in supervision. So GEMS questions is what I like to use, solution-focused question techniques, rather than simply, if you're just always asking information-based questions, what you're doing there is you're just it's a managerial way of supervision by saying, what are you doing next? What's happening here? Why are you doing that? Even they're very information-based questions. So try to throw in some gems. A gem of a question is brilliant in supervision, and GEMS comes from brief solution focused therapy. It's a questioning method that sits around asking goal setting questions, asking exception finding questions, asking miracle questions, and scaling questions. So I've done a slide on each of these to give you some ideas of the kinds of questions that could be useful to ask in supervision. So to ask goal setting questions, this is about helping the student to identify or clarify their goals, the outcomes, what they're wanting to achieve. So you might ask a question like, what's your aim with this piece of work? What outcomes are you actually looking for here? What do you want to get from this supervision session? What do you want to know by the end of this discussion that you don't know now? What are your hopes in this situation? Anything like that helps them to identify their goals, what they want to achieve, what they're wanting to get. That can be really helpful, goal setting questions. the next set of questions in a GEMS is exception finding. Now, these are the ones that I personally find the most difficult to ask. On my own CPD plan, almost every year on my CPD plan, I always put asking more exception finding questions, because I know they're great, but I'm not very good at framing them or using them. So I'm going to run through some exception finding questions now, but then I noticed Louise was saying, because Louise had the slides before, and Louise said she'd like to talk about the exception finding questions. So I'm fascinated to see what I'm going to learn as well here from Louise. But for me, exception finding questions, I find them really difficult to ask, but I know they're really good questions. So exception finding questions help the person to see that they've got the resources themselves to solve their own their own difficulties. So for students, an exception finding question helps them to recognize they know the answer that they're wanting. You know, they know what they need to do, but helps them to have the confidence in that. So you might ask a student, when you have felt confident about doing something, what was different then? Of all the things that you've done to enhance your learning, which has been the most effective? In what ways is this challenge new for you? How did you do that, and what was different that time? So I might say, if they come and they say, I just don't know what to do, I just don't feel confident, I might say, well, have you ever felt confident in a situation like this? And what was different then? Those kinds of things are exception finding questions. It is about trying to help someone find the exception to the rule. And I do find these, from my own perspective, I know I find these challenging. But Louise, you were saying you wanted to share something at this slide. I don't know if it was specifically about exception finding questions or if it was about the questions we ask of students. I'm not sure.
It was sort of, it made me think about just sort of inviting the student to sort of see the positives in what they've done and their strengths and where those might be. It sort of made me think about Dloos and some of his sort of worries, and at the beginning of his placement, where he's had a lot of experience with older teenagers, but where we work with younger teenagers, and just sort of anxieties around that and getting them into engage. And as time has gone on, Dloos now really able to speak confidently about his work with one of the kids, the younger brother of one of the children, that the families that we're working with, and sort of asking those questions and inviting him to talk about you know, his sort of feelings before the visit, the feelings after, and his confidence in that, and what he has done differently. And he actually said, you were talking earlier about when you said about the when you were undertaking supervision, asking them to go and sort of find something in the house that they could describe. Well, he actually done that during a virtual visit with one of with the same child last week, and sort of hearing Dloos talk about that and the way he described it, and just the words that he used, I felt like I could really sort of visualize the visit, and I could sort of see it through his eyes. And again, it's, you know, it's a new thing for Dloos doing it's a new thing for all of us doing virtual visits. It's not something I ever thought I would be doing. But it's supporting the student to sort of pull out those, you know, really good bits of practice and really, you know, positive sort of bits that have come from the visits, and getting them to sort of reflect on that, what it means for them, their development.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Louise. Thank you. It is that, isn't it? That finding what you do really well, and that keeping things positive. Thanks for that. So that's exception finding questions. And we're going to go to miracle questions, the M. Miracle questions. That's really about helping people envisage answers. Now, the classic miracle question that everyone knows is, if you had a magic wand, what would you do? But one that I've always really liked is, if you could go back in time and do something differently, what would you do? And how would that have changed what's happening now? Or how would that impact on the situation? I think it's a miracle question because you can't go back in time. But one I've used this year a lot and worked brilliantly is imagine you could go 20 years into the future. What do you want that child to remember about social work involvement in their life? And that can be really helpful at framing what should we be doing now, here and now. So, just thinking about asking different kinds of questions really prompts learning. If you were to have a dream about a solution, what would happen in the dream? I've not tried that one. If I'm honest, it's the only one of all these I've not tried, but I know it's a classic miracle question that quite a few managers do use. And then the final kind of question in GEMS is a scaling question. And that's to prompt thinking about significance and change. How important is this? How can we change this? So you might say to a student, for example, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not at all and 5 is very confident, how confident do you feel? But then you have to follow that up with a tail. So you would then have to, if a student said I'm a 2, you'd have to say, well, what would it take to move you to a 3 or a 4? So a scaling question always has to be followed with a tail. So I've really just tried to give you some ideas about the kinds of questions you might ask in supervision. And I've got others that are just popping up on the screen now for you to take away. I'm not going to go through all of them. But what I'm just going to suggest is that what's called academically, what promotes praxis, is seen as Socratic questioning. Socrates was a philosopher, so there's a P, who got people to really delve more deeply into their thinking by asking lots of linked questions, just constant questions, if you like. So continuing to ask questions as opposed to give answers is a really good way of helping people find solutions and probe into deeper learning. Final few P's, problem solving. Often people come to supervision just wanting you to solve their problems, but a key aspect is rather than problem solving, we should be solution focused in our supervision. We need to turn problems into solutions. So asking questions like GEMS questions, which are solution focused, are important. And up on the screen now, I'm not going to read all of it because of time, but is what do we mean by solution-focused supervision, and how can we promote a solution-focused approach to supervision? So let's turn the problem into a solution is another P. And then pretty much almost the final P, but not quite, is portfolio. Look, there's a load of P's on this slide. The portfolio is the product of the placement, isn't it? It provides a picture of what the student's been doing, about the professional, about their practice. You might have to do a practice educator portfolio. That provides a picture of you as a professional and your practice as a practice educator. And it's there, the illustration is the portfolio as a puzzle. Supervision should be a space where you can talk about the development of the portfolio. So I wanted to bring that P in. In supervision, I've told you I open with a postcard. I always do. I open with a postcard and I close with what we call concluding reflections. I don't know if you find this, but very often what happens in supervision is it almost peters out a bit. It's like, any other business? When are we seeing each other again? Are we done then? It's kind of, what do we do at the end of supervision? So I have a clear end to every supervision session that I provide. I know that some supervisors use a different method each week and have a concluding reflection every week, and that's okay. I use the same. So I use a specific regular method to conclude every supervision session. And the method I use is the University of York: surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, learning. And the illustration there shows it on road signs, because for me, it helps to pinpoint progress along the journey. So it helps to, that double P, pinpointing progress. It's all about what surprises a student at the beginning of a placement. 3 weeks later, they're not surprised by that. 6 weeks in, they've forgotten they were even surprised by it in the first place. So what this does is it shows growth, it shows progress. You can draw on it when you come to write your final report, because you've got all of this growth and progress ongoing. So all the P's, I'm going to ask Chris in a moment now, what P's have been in the chat that we haven't done yet? But I'm going to end this up by wrapping up the presentation today with a P of a present. I think the best gift that a practice educator can give to a student is good quality, reflective, emotionally supportive supervision, so that they can take that throughout their whole entire career in recognising what is good quality supervision. It's the best gift we can ever give, our presence to students. And these are all the P's I thought of when I was doing the presentation. I was putting it together. These are all the P's I got. I didn't do every P in the presentation because I thought I need to prioritise the P's. I need to find the P's that are really important for today's presentation. But ultimately, you know, there are models of reflection, aren't there? There's the 4 F's of reflection, there's the 10 C's of resilience, all of that. I was thinking, oh, how many P's have I got of supervision? And I gave up at the point of 105. I thought you can't develop a model of 105 P's of supervision. It doesn't work. No one's ever going to remember more than 10. So, but they're the P's that I got. I don't know how many P's we got in the chat that haven't been covered, but you will get the slides today, which have all of the references on them as well. But let's go back to wrapping it all up with the present and being present in supervision. And so I'm going to ask you, Chris, now, what P's did we get in the chat that we've not covered in the presentation? Did we have any P's shared at the beginning of the presentation that I've not covered as we've gone through? You're on mute, Chris. Just need to unmute.
Thank you. So I've just posted into the chat a little tally of all of the P's that you mentioned, and where there's a yes against it, people mentioned it, and where there isn't a yes, they didn't mention it. So actually, I think you had more P's that people didn't mention than P's that people did mention, which I thought was interesting. Also, I did just Google how many P's are there in the English language, and actually there are 60,000. So 100, you know, or 105 gets quite close. But okay, so getting on to the question you actually asked, let's have some of the P's that you didn't mention. So participate and participation. Oh, actually, sorry, let me just get, yes, that's right. Yes, so I don't think you mentioned participate and participation. Passion.
Oh,
PCF.
yes.
PCF was also mentioned.
Yeah.
People and people focused. Shall I carry on? Performance management and performance. Permitted. Person and person centered. I know you had personal, but person and person centered were mentioned. Personal development, personal reflection, personalization. You talked about personal, but there were interesting, you know, inflections of the word personal. Please, policy, and polite were mentioned. Practicalities, practice focused, and actually the distinction between practice with a C and practice with an S. Praise, I thought was a very nice one there. Prevention, priorities, prioritized, priority, projection, promote, protection, and lastly, pry, P-R-Y. So that was the list of all of the words that people mentioned in the chat that you didn't mention.
Yeah, fabulous. So I think they're probably, most of them, I think, will appear on that list, but not in the actual presentation, other than the word pry, which I find that's an interesting one to stick in. So yeah, fabulous. Thank you very much. So at this point, Chris, I think we have, we've got about 10 minutes or so left. If there are any particular questions for either me or for Dloo or for Louise, I think now is a good time to have those. But you also talked about maybe switching on everybody's cameras, and this might be a good time for us to do that now. We can actually, if people want their cameras switching on, I don't know how you would normally do it. I would normally say, put your hand up if you want your camera on, and then we can then promote them to be a panelist. Look at the P's that are flying around everywhere, promoting you to panelist. Then you can we can switch on your cameras and we can join in more of a group conversation. Then everybody becomes a panelist. So I think. Well,
I think I can see that. I was just looking to see if people have got hands up. I think I saw a hand up. But I mean, if people would like at this point to ask any questions, it would be great. I mean, we've got a bit of time, haven't we? We can do the group photo at the end.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there were some things that were mentioned along the way. So Veronica made a particular comment about the slide showing the flow of power, and that was one of the things, Siobhan, that you particularly mentioned. Let's see what's coming in now. Sue's making a comment, just saying useful session, but she's off. I think that there was a comment about from Paula about the difficulty of facing change in the virtual world, and you know, having habits of particular ways of going about things. So I don't know whether there were any questions that come out of that.
I can see, Chris, quite a few people saying that they need to leave for a meeting at 4, which is absolutely fine and understandable. Yep. So I often try and think, well, let's finish everything at 5 too, because people always dash on to the next thing. There's no transitions anymore, is there? There's no jumping in the car to move to somewhere. You're just literally sitting at your computer screen. So I get that people need to leave. So it might be just worth us saying that there is one more of these 3 sessions. So I'll be doing a session on the assessment in the virtual world. Now that'll be relevant, I think, for practice educators, but also for people working with newly qualified social workers as well. So we'll be looking at assessment principles and practice, really. But we won't be using the letter P next time. We'll have something different next time.
And I think I'm right in saying that that's on Friday, the 4th of December.
Yeah. From 10 to 12.
Okay.
So yes, a morning session. Okay, well, shall we, let's see what we've got here. Oh yeah, so Veronica's saying she's definitely going to be using some of those P's in her supervision.